He got his PhD from University of California, Berkeley in comparative literature. And today he's here to present his work, Beyond Collective Memory, Thinking About Archives in Senegal. So we're very excited to have that. Cullen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. I do have some slides, so let me see if I can take advantage of the screen share capacity, and I will get started. Okay, so my talk today is titled Beyond Collective Memory, Thinking About Archives in Thiaroye, Senegal. This talk is about and partially drawn from my recent book, Beyond Collective Memory, Structural Complicity and Future Freedoms in Senegalese and South African Narratives. I'll first talk about Beyond Collective Memory as a whole, before moving to a discussion drawn directly from the book of what archive and archive might mean and do. I conclude with a colonial Senegalese text that could belong in the kind of archive we need. Beyond Collective Memory looks at the narratives that surround two places, Thiaroye, today a marginal neighborhood of Dakar, and District 6, once a large area of central Cape Town. For certain publics, the two places are icons of memory of particular episodes of racist violence. In the Thiaroye military camp outside of Dakar in 1944, French colonial forces, West African colonial soldiers among them, massacred West African colonial soldiers. These tirailleurs had recently returned from World War II Europe and had demanded the back pay that they were owed. Today, basic facts about the massacre, such as the number and identities of the dead and the locations of their burial, remain unknown. If this history is familiar to non-West African audiences, it is likely due to Ousmane Sembène's 1987 film, Camp de Thiaroye, Thiaroye Camp, which positions itself as an act of collective memory. Today, the former French military camp is a Senegalese military camp, and the community of Thiaroye is a banlieue, a peripheral suburb of Dakar, devastated by the structural adjustment policies of the 80s and 90s that international financial institutions imposed upon indebted, formerly colonized nations. District 6 is a site of apartheid-era forced displacement. In 1966, the apartheid government declared Cape Town's Central District 6 reserved for white occupation. Over a period of more than 15 years, the district was razed and its approximately 60,000 residents, most of whom were classified as colored, forcibly removed to the segregated periphery of the city. In a post-apartheid South Africa dominated by neoliberal economic policies, very few former residents have been able to return under the terms of the land restitution program. Large swaths of land remain expanses of grass and rubble, while portions are undergoing rapid private development. Today, the most visible producer of District 6 memory discourse is the District 6 Museum, located downtown on the edge of the district. The museum opened its doors in the year of South Africa's first democratic elections. Myriad commemorative narratives in a range of media have been generated around these two places, from plaques, literary texts, and oral testimonies to films and the aforementioned museum. These works ask us to collectively recall racist oppression and resistant community. Yet Thiaroye and District 6, as I hope the brief accounts I just gave made clear, are not only icons of a remote memory, they're places in the present that make evident the fact that elements of the structural violence of the colonial and apartheid past have not ended. The post-colonial state inherited the structure of the colonial and apartheid state. Hierarchies of gender, inherited social status, and in South Africa, race remain. Racialized capitalism continues to organize the distribution of wealth in South Africa, the segregation of South African cities, and the position of both Senegal and South Africa within global economic and political networks. Because Thiaroye is likely the less familiar of the two locations, I'd like to speak a little more about it. So on this is I believe, a colonial era map from probably the 1950s. Thiaroye Mer is a way of referring to Thiaroye. So it's right here where you can see my cursor. Thiaroye is situated near the base of the Cape Verde Peninsula, 11 kilometers from downtown Dakar, which is here, the former colonial city, and 8 kilometers north of Goree Island, which is right here. A nationally and internationally recognized site of memory of the Atlantic slave trade, a Senegalese and UNESCO World Heritage Site. A small place in contemporary Senegal and lacking the status Goree possesses, Thiaroye nonetheless has global historical significance. The victims and some of the perpetrators of the Thiaroye massacre were Thiaroye Senegalese. Despite the name Thiaroye were not specifically Senegalese. Founded in 1857, the same year that the colonial city of Dakar was founded, the Thiaroye force was composed of Black colonial subjects and went on to conquer large portions of Africa for France, and then to maintain French empire across the globe. By the early 20th century, Thiaroye came from throughout the Federation of French West Africa. Today, Thiaroye, as I noted, is a peripheral banlieue of Dakar. What was once the French colonial military camp is a Senegalese camp, but much of it is put to civilian uses, including a school, a hospital, and garden plots. Thiaroye residents are predominantly Wolof speakers. In Beyond Collective Memory, I look at how Ousmane Sembène's film and the permanent exhibit of the District 6 Museum call upon the idea of collective memory and position themselves as collective memories. I then turn to living interlocutors in Cape Town and in Thiaroye, as well as to lesser known texts, such as the play Thiaroye Terre Rouge by Senegalese author Boubacar Boris Diop, and works of fiction by the queer District 6 born author Richard Reeve. Such narratives and oral exchanges rarely invoke a notion of collective memory, and in my analysis, they grapple with the complexities and possible continuities of colonial and apartheid violence. My research and ultimately the book emerged in part from my fascination with the ways that people experience and represent places, African urban places in particular, and the cities of Dakar and Cape Town even more specifically. These cities are ones I'm closely connected to, Cape Town by parentage, Dakar by experience. Beyond Collective Memory is based on both textual and social research in 3 languages, Wolof, French, and English. I spent many months speaking with current and former residents of the 2 places in which the book is anchored, as well as engaged in archival research and textual analysis. Originally a thesis in comparative literature, the book also grew out of my curiosity about the ways that different cultural texts represent our relationships to the colonial and apartheid pasts. And it led to my critique of the limitations of the idea of collective memory for representing the complexity of those pasts and our relationship to them. In Beyond Collective Memory, I argue that the notion that we can collectively recall violence that we did not ourselves experience often erases the ambivalent positions of historical agents and distances the violence of the past from the present. This drawing of sharp distinctions between historical victims and perpetrators and between the past and the present can obscure enduring structural violence. By attending to works that eschew binary memories and insist upon historically intermediary positions, and that do not invite us to quote unquote remember the experience of historical victims, we might explore the very different ways we have been implicated in historical violence and are implicated in ongoing structural violence. The book's full title suggests the basic arc of the argument. If we think about colonial and apartheid pasts in ways other than through metaphors of collective memory, we might investigate historical structural complicity and glimpse the future freedoms evoked in African texts and narratives that work outside of the discourses of collective memory. So I want to talk briefly about what I mean by structural complicity. I consider complicity to be a region of ethical implication in a political system or set of relationships. Complicity is not an action of perpetration or collaboration. It is closer to a condition. In thinking of complicity in this way, I draw upon and differ from a number of scholars, among them Mark Saunders. In my thinking, questions of ethical complicity in colonial and apartheid violence are raised when we look at a specific kind of structurally produced implication. This quote unquote structural complicity characterizes intermediary positions in racialized hierarchies created by colonial and apartheid states. Occupants of such intermediary positions were targets of structural violence, as well as its agents, or in a limited and relative sense, its beneficiaries. This kind of complicity derives from the structural character of apartheid and colonial violence, rather than from the intentions or choices or actions of the historical actors who occupied these positions. Colonial apartheid regimes created many complicit positions, such as that of the Thiaroye Senegalese, who were both objects and agents of imperial violence, and that of the South African quasi-citizens classified as colored, who were oppressed by the apartheid state, even as they were privileged relative to those classified as quote unquote native or quote unquote Bantu. When we recognize and investigate such intermediary, structurally ambivalent positions, what I call structurally complicit positions, and forms of participation, we also recognize and investigate the fundamentally structural character of apartheid and colonial violence. One story of how the book came to be begins with my 2011 pre-dissertation research trip to Dakar, when I learned that a Senegalese civil society group, an association of geography and history teachers, had penned an open letter to the then president Abdoulaye Wade, asking that archaeological excavation of potential mass grave sites containing the bodies of Thiaroye soldiers be carried out before the new national tollway, now long finished, would be constructed over those sites. No excavation ever took place. I was intrigued by this epistolary activism, its origins and its possible future outcomes, and I became curious about how Thiaroye residents, as opposed to activist intellectuals, might talk about the 1944 massacre. What did they have to say about local history? And what accounted for the status of Goree Island, located right across the bay from Thiaroye, as a world and national heritage site on the one hand, and the particular neglect to which Thiaroye was subject on the other? I would bring similar questions to my District 6 research. To what extent did my district interlocutors participate in locally dominant discourses about the memory of the district? And what accounted for the transnational memorial status of nearby Robben Island and the particular marginal status of District 6? Beyond collective memory is an invitation to consider different African colonial and apartheid pasts, different narratives and different metaphors beyond that of collective memory through which to understand those pasts. I wrote the book not only for African and Africanist scholars, but also for everyone who works in some way on histories of violence and who is open to reflecting critically on which pasts we acknowledge, how we narrate those pasts, and how we understand our highly varied relationships to them. Through the process of making the book, I came to conclude that the metaphor of collective memory, especially particular employments of it, is not helping us to reckon with the violence, especially the structural violence and the complicities of the past and the present. To name a particular narrative as a shared memory risks naturalizing that narrative, hardening collective identity boundaries, and placing a violent past at a sometimes false remove from a remembering present. More often, we do not collectively remember the multiple positions and complex forms of participation that structures of violence demand. Rather than naturalize an ostensibly shared memory of the past, we need to investigate occluded and neglected pasts and narratives, and thereby bring more awareness to both the colonial past and the somewhat post-colonial present. Beyond collective memory invites readers to think critically about institutionally recognized so-called memories, and to explore the histories and imaginaries that such memories elide. Figuratively speaking, the book asks us to stand in Thiaroye and look across the bay, as this photograph does at Goree, the so-called memory island. To continue the analogy, my hope is that traveling today to Thiaroye, a place shaped by multiple forms of historical and contemporary violence, will allow us to think critically about public discourses of commemoration that surround places such as Goree, as well as about the alternatives to collective memory that we might find when we stand in a place like Thiaroye, site of memory for a much more limited public, and a place where a still obscured colonial massacre took place. So, if not collective remembrance, if not the imperative that we listen and read and thus never forget, what then? What metaphors might allow us to engage with the complexity of the colonial past and of our highly varied and unequal present positions? If we are learning and not remembering, what kinds of listening and reading might we need? During my periods of research in Dakar in 2011 and 2013, it was a commonplace that France is hiding the archive, the archival documents or archive pertaining to the massacre. To my initial surprise, the word came up frequently in both Wolof and French conversations and in reference to multiple histories. This ubiquitous employment signals an intense preoccupation with historical truth and a concomitant, equally intense skepticism regarding the possibility that the full truth of the past will be publicly told. In Dakar, the meaning of archive extended far beyond the walls of institutional holdings to encompass people as well as heterogeneous objects. One young man, for example, explained the word to me. By way of example, his friend, like many of their peers, had attempted to reach Spain and thus the EU via repurposed fishing boat. Unsuccessful, he had returned. A piece of his paper in his pocket had traveled with him. The smudged, seawater-stained paper, which he keeps still, is archive. Another interlocutor illustrated with an anecdote. As children, he and his friends had believed that the soldiers were buried beneath the large, flat stones located near an entrance to the military camp. Those stones, he explained, are archive. Archive is not a word that has been absorbed and transformed by daily use in the English and Afrikaans of Cape Town. If archive came up in my conversations with former district residents, it referred to the holdings of relevant historical documents, perhaps in the suggestion that I visit the provincial archives, or in reference to the research that had been required to support a land claim application. Yet the concept that the will of archive denotes is pervasive, as is the contemporary context of structural violence in which a preoccupation with historical truth and artifact anchors. The democratically elected government and the existence of a constitutionally mandated land restitution process has not created an equal society and a shared experience of freedom. It is clear to all that state recognition of apartheid injustice has not informed the reshaping of Cape Town. The vast majority of Cape Townians forcibly relocated to the periphery live there still. Among former district residents, intense suspicion surrounds a post-apartheid restitution process that has lacked transparency and democracy, and that has not provided long-promised homes. Files and submitted restitution claims have disappeared without explanation. Thousands of claimants, having successfully submitted proof of historical residence in the district, have nonetheless been unable to return to the city. In this immense disjuncture between the formerly post-apartheid present and a once anticipated liberation, it is difficult to know what kind of historical evidence might herald a more than formal freedom. This uncertainty, apparent in the many ellipses of my transcriptions and in the caveats and questions of former residents, seems to impel the saving and displaying of objects that are to provide evidence of two histories, that of the old district and that of the ongoing post-apartheid period of waiting. People showed and explained and sometimes gave me a great variety of material objects and creative works, copies of filed restitution claims, a supporting historical narrative, a father's military discharge certificate, and a certificate testifying that a non-white person has permission to attend the University of Cape Town. Family photographs, the name plaque of a house, cut out and saved newspaper images of mid-20th century Cape Town, a reproduction of a fanciful 1899 painting of the city, recordings of performances of District 6 musical, post-1994 press clippings, a date palm, a stone bench, salvaged iron terrace railings. It is as if these archivists want to summon proof powerful enough to bring a post-apartheid city into existence. In Thiaroye, I ask an elderly resident, Elage, what he means by archive. Elage was an exceptional and generous interlocutor who spent his working life as a cartographer and museologist. The ontological bent of his conception of archive and of historical knowledge belies what must have been a formal training in the organization and use of textual archives and a concomitant positivist understanding of research and knowledge. However, rather than imply that knowledge has an objective existence, perhaps in an archive where it awaits the diligent researcher, Elage suggested to me that historical knowledge is produced in interaction. His explanation begins with the desire to know and concludes with the idea that sources, whatever their form, become archive when we draw knowledge from them. So I'm going to read the Wolof to bring Wolof into the room, and I invite people to perhaps read the English to themselves. C'est-à-dire archive bokofeke dangabagaham nyar defam nyari façon ham defam ham bing hamne nuachla wantakila wach defainek témoin oculaire, témoin giskis, témoin degdeg, témoin bufeke amdet leginak bufeke na aussi dangabagadem chi archivi nonu danulai netali archive lanlai netali lo fekeul peut-être lusamam fekeul archivio yunak yifokangaham fangakoi feka. Donc, pour bouger warchi l'histoire, fonga am ay source. Fo djele, fo tibe, alors fonga tibe, nak momoy archive. Two ways of knowing will, the context of the explanation suggests, correspond to two kinds of archive. A particular chamin, a façon cham, will suit a particular kind of archive because people and documents differ. Yet, in Elage's presentation, the two kinds of archive behave similarly, both tell. Archival documents netali, recount or narrate, just as living witnesses do. If someone or something tells you, listen, there is, it seems, only one chamin, one method. Listening is the primary way of knowing. Research happens in an interaction resembling a conversation. Elage's response moves from a desire to know to ways of arriving at historical knowledge to the kinds of places where one might find it. The sequence is grounded in the practice of a researcher, but it is also grounded in the ontology of archive. Desire and method bring archive into existence. Archive do not only recount in dialogue with the researcher, they also feed the hungry seeker. The final verb that Elage employs, tibe, evokes a meal rather than a conversation. Tibe means to take a handful of something. By far the most common daily employment of tibe is in relation to a meal. Eating with your hand, you tibe in the shared bowl. Tibe, unlike lekka, eat, evokes the partaking of a shared meal rather than the consumption of food. Tib, therefore, does not suggest a unidirectional conception of knowledge discovery. Sources are not objects to be found or eaten. Research is not akin to extraction or consumption. Archives are not sources and collections alone because, in Elage's metaphor, sources do not exist independently from the desires and social practices that bring them into being. In the world of meal preparation and sharing that Elage's Tib summons, meals exist because of our need for social and physical nourishment and because of our social and culinary skill. Desire and practice create archive and meals, and knowledge and fulfillment from the world. Research, like the making and sharing of meals and conversations, is a dialectical process. Archives are one participants in a dialogue, one meal in a world of human hunger and culinary labor. And archives, like meals, are nourishing and to be shared. This conception obliquely challenges a world in which historical knowledge is often not for sharing, where witnesses cannot speak publicly without risk, historical documents vanish or remain classified, and institutional archives are accessible only to a few, their contents collected and organized according to the interests of the powerful. Elage's conclusion seems to suggest that all the world, anywhere you might tibe, could become archive. Yet this idea of archive is in fact circumscribed. Among people, only witnesses, those present for the historical episodes in question, can become sources of knowledge. Among documents, archive can only be those that tell you what you need. The emphasis on accurate documents and on witnesses who were themselves present exists in direct relationship to the quiet but active suppressions of histories, colonial and post-colonial, of violence. Within many narratives of memory, elements of the physical landscape or imagined figures of the past evoke historical violence or lost community. Visitors, readers, and viewers are invited to understand representations of the past as memories and to assimilate them into their own individual memories. Elage's archive, on the other hand, foregrounds the roles of seekers and collectors in creating and making meaning of encounters, whether with documents or people, stones or streets. Beyond collective memory identifies the intertwined political and conceptual limitations of a body of narratives about the past. Yet the book does not propose a particular genre or corpus, an archive in that sense, that would convey the complexity of the past with more accuracy. Rather, I make two suggestions: that we look back to the critiques enacted by texts about historical violence that were created before the dominance of collective memory, in my periodization and before the 80s and 90s. And that we bring renewed attention to the ways that our desires inform how we select and make meanings of texts in the world, that we read with Elage's conception of archive or archive, an encounter created by desire and skill, rather than ask cultural texts to collapse important distances between the past and its representation, between different unequal subject positions, or between a text and the meaning we make of it. We might bring renewed attention to the way that our desires and interpretive operations inform how we understand the past and its textual renderings. The latter chapters of Beyond Collective Memory are concerned with what an archive of complicity might be. To the extent that such an archive is a body of texts and not solely a way of encountering them, I propose the inclusion of Bakary Diallo's autobiographical novel, a text published in French in 1926 and one which I'm translating. Diallo, like the unidentified men massacred in Thiaroye in 1944, was a tirailleur. He thus occupied the kind of structurally ambivalent, complicit position that has been central to my thinking. His book, Force Bonté, Force Goodness, is largely an account of his experience of being a colonial soldier. The narrative is the only known account of participation in World War I authored by an African colonial soldier. Yet the text's value extends beyond its status as historical evidence. Force Bonté is also fascinating to read as a work of literature and as a participant in multiple discourses of its time. It is a text deeply preoccupied with the possibility of encounter and connection across distances, both spatial and social. And as do other texts of its largely pre-nation state nationalist era, Diallo's narrative performs what I think of as a complicit critique of the French Empire. I want to emphasize here that Force Bonté is not concerned with the nation state, even in an anticipatorily nationalist fashion. In no way does it envision Senegalese national independence. Diallo's narrative rarely references Senegal, and when Senegalais is mentioned, it refers to the Pulaar language or to Diallo's fellow Pulaar speakers. Senegal in Diallo's text is not Senegal as we think of it now. So I would like to end with a colonial postcard of telegraph lines in Dakar and with one of, sorry, where did my image? Do folks see my image? People see the postcard?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. Fabulous, sorry, there was a weird moment of black screen. I would like to end with a colonial postcard of telegraph lines in Dakar and with one of the many passages in Diallo's narrative in which desire appears as a force powerful enough to transcend immense distances. The year is 1911. Leaving Dakar the previous night on a ship with his fellow colonial troops, Diallo watches the horizon until the last he can see of Dakar is La Télégraphie, the infrastructure responsible for sending telegrams. When he wakes for the first time at sea, Diallo searches in vain for a glimpse of land. The telegraph returns in his articulation of yearning. In the distance, where the triumphant sun, more majestic than ever, rises, the sun whitens. Close to the ocean liner, as if they wanted to tease it or to understand what this whale is, white birds, a little splotched with gray and blue, are intent upon their acrobatic maneuvers and stunts. Their frenetic wings remind me of the handkerchiefs waving farewell in Dakar's port. My body trembles and my spirit telegraphs along a mysterious magnetic wire with all that I love in Senegal. Thank you.
Thank you, Cullen, for that very interesting presentation. So we're going to open up the floor to questions. We'll do 3 rounds of questions. I'll do 3 questions per round. You're more than welcome to raise your hand or just unmute. We'll do questions first, and then Cullen can take a minute and he can answer all of them. Yeah?
Sounds good, yes.
Yes, the floor is open.
Questions can also be if there are things that, I mentioned briefly that people are wondering about, or images that you want to go back to. That's also totally fine.
See, someone has a hand raised. I just can't see who it is. Please go ahead. Oh, Camille, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for that, Cullen. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more what you meant by critical complicity. So there's a nice term that might be opened up.
Thank you. So we do.
Hi, Cullen. Hi, Cullen. Before you respond, I would like you to just comment about the observation you made about the former president of Senegal, who was responsible for the larger-than-life monument under the theme of the African Renaissance and his deliberate ignoring the letter that was written, by the team or the group of teachers that you mentioned. What was the letter disrupting in his notion or in his so-called nationalism?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay.
Anyone else before we answer these?
It looks like there's a question in the chat.
Yeah. Could you talk a little more about historical distance as an element as we perform in the archives? I think you can respond to these and we'll do the next round afterwards.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Those are really good questions. So Camille asked about critical complicity. I actually, so, at the very end of the talk, when I'm talking about Bakary Diallo's Fausse Bonté and suggesting that his narrative is doing something different that we should pay attention to and include in our imaginary archive of texts that treat historical violence in Africa, I talk about it performing a complicit critique. So complicit critique is my way of talking about a critique that is emanating from a structurally complicit position and that acknowledges implication rather than a sort of, for example, like an explicit manifesto of resistance. That might be an articulation of resistance. Maybe it's a critique, but it's not one that's emanating from that kind of position, nor is it one that's really, to my mind, accounting for the complexity of the violent structure in which any articulation of critique is made. Yeah, I think it's a concept that I really talk about more in subsequent work on Bakary Diallo's narrative rather than in the book itself. But I did want to end the talk with some sense of like, okay, if I'm saying there's something that isn't working, if I'm saying that this metaphor of collective memory is actually limiting how we are investigating and thinking about the past, I wanted to offer like some alternatives, right? So one alternative is like this idea of archive that I understand from Elage. That's part of an alternative. And then another alternative is this sense of what kinds of texts we've neglected that we might include and what kinds of critiques those texts contain. Okay, so then there was a question about Abdoulaye Wade, so the prior president of Senegal from 2000 to 2012. So I think, I think it's worth noting that Abdoulaye Wade was sort of marked an important era in Senegalese history because this was the first change of political parties since independence. Not the first change of power between individuals, but the first change of power between parties. And he was responsible for many very big, somewhat ugly infrastructure projects, including the construction of this tollway that I mentioned, and also the monument to the African Renaissance that the professor mentioned. So I think the question is why would Wade not want to address the contents of this letter? And I am not really sure how to speculate about that, except that 2004 was the first year that a state president acknowledged that the Thiaroye massacre had occurred, that the people had been killed unjustly, and that president was Abdoulaye Wade. So on the one hand, here was a state then followed by French President Hollande that acknowledged that something had occurred, and there was sort of a celebration of the Thiaroye, but this sort of pseudo celebration did not go along with a real investigation, and it still has not. So there's a real disjuncture between some level of public attention and state recognition and anything like research, let alone reparations. Like, for, you know, if part of your vision of justice is reparations, you need to at least know who to reparate to. You'd want to identify who was killed and where they are, right? So I feel like the very short answer is this continues to threaten French interests in the relationship between Senegal and France. I mean, France is the responsible power. So if something is not moving, I feel like it ultimately goes back to that relationship. Okay, so the final question I see, so could you talk a little more about historical distancing as the element we perform in archives? So what I meant was that the metaphor of memory, to my mind, in itself enacts some distancing, because if we can remember violence, it's at a bit of a remove from where we are now, because it's the object of our memory. So if we say, I don't know, I remember administrative violence enacted by the state, that's implying that the state isn't currently enacting administrative violence. So that's the bit about distancing that I'm aware of, like, pertains directly to what I think this metaphor is doing, part of what it's doing. I think, I don't think archives are necessarily doing that. I'm excited by this idea, what I think Elhaj was communicating in his explanation to me of archive, that that they are not simply physical sources or holdings of physical sources, but sort of a moment in a dialectical process, because I think that is more accountable to our own sort of desires and practices as collectors and researchers and organizers of you know, the material world that reflects on the past. So I'm not sure if I totally answered that question, but yeah, David Dean, did that answer your question? Okay, fabulous, thank you. If I don't know, so if other people feel like they're still curious or I didn't fully answer your question, please let me know.
Okay, we have Noor, your hand is up. You are free to ask your question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sapna. Thanks, Cullen, for a very interesting presentation. I'd like you to kind of comment and reflect on some kind of comparative dimensions. You know, your presentation focused, you know, principally on the Senegal example, but I wonder if you could offer some reflections, comparative reflections, you know, between that context and District 6.
Yeah.
Perhaps along the following lines. Okay. It seems to me that one of the arguments that you're presenting, and I'm oversimplifying in order to convey a particular you know, argument, involves the production of collective memories in particular sites, such as a museum. And so if you could say something about how the different contexts in particular sites produce collective memories. And I would imagine that there are important differences. And linked to that, how those processes of production of collective memory, say for example in District 6 Museum, which I'm more familiar with, relate to other existing memories outside of those sites. And whether those present, whether there's any kind of interaction, and whether those present possibilities of disrupting processes of the production of collective memories. And then my final question is, you know, it is related, but it speaks to some extent to David Dean's question about the archives. I mean, it seems to me that, and you know, and again, I'm asking you to comment perhaps more on the Senegal example, because I'm more familiar with the District 6 example, that what one has in District 6 Museum is not a static archive. It's not archive for the purposes of preservation, but it's an archive that is used very deliberately in the contemporary as part of movement building, as part of campaigning about the prison, the inequalities of the prison, not only around land restitution, but also about continuous segregation, ignoring of slave history and so on. So I wonder whether there's something similar happening. First of all, whether you agree with that, and whether there's something similar happening in Senegal. Otherwise, I think that we may be left with an idea of the archive as something static and not active, and in fact actively used in contemporary politics, including contemporary contentious politics. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Because it's 3 questions.
Oh, that's fine.
So yeah, there were a few questions in there, right? There are many obvious differences between the 2 places and the 2 kinds of histories that some actors are presenting as a collective memory. So I think maybe I can give a general but relevant answer to the first part of the question, which is that one of the differences is that speaking to former residents of District 6, as well as to descendants and other actors, the forced removal is an event that directly affected the people I was speaking with, and that is well within living memory for many people. And in Thiaroye, the people who were killed were soldiers from all over West Africa who were killed within a military camp, within sight and within hearing of the adjacent communities. So Thiaroye residents in 1944 were affected in a much less direct way, right? I wasn't talking to the descendants of victim, like younger generations of families in which people had been killed in Thiaroye. I did speak to people who suspected that they had relatives who were killed in the massacre, but nobody knows for sure, and these weren't people who lived in Thiaroye. So the relationship of local residents to the event is very different. One of the other big differences in context is that South Africa is a much wealthier country than Senegal, and there is nothing analogous to an archive of Thiaroye in Dakar or a District 6 museum in Dakar, or what there is in terms of a site, which I think is part of the question, is the official military cemetery of Thiaroye, which is a state site looked after by the Senegalese military, which once was a French colonial military cemetery. It is in Thiaroye, outside of the military camp. It existed before the massacre in 1944. Many people believe that the soldiers massacred in the massacre are not in fact buried in the cemetery, or that only some of them are, or that they're in mass graves within the cemetery that don't correspond to the grave markers. So this state site does not have a lot of meaning for people, as far as I know. It is a place where since 2004, state leaders, principally other West African state leaders, have gathered. On the anniversary of this holiday that Abdoulaye Wade created, which is not the anniversary of the massacre, but is instead a date he chose because it has some significance in World War I military history, and to avoid any political conflict about raising the issue of the massacre. So there's an annual date in August, which is the Thiaroye holiday, and state leaders gather in the cemetery then. So these are very different places, obviously, in terms of what these histories are, right? Like 15 years of forced removal is different from a massacre, but also in the ways in which, the relationship of contemporary residents to those past and the ways in which they're present or not now. So one result of that difference is that I found former residents I spoke to participating to some extent in discourses of collective memory produced by folks like the museum in a way that was totally absent in Thiaroye. So the sort of set pieces of what people recall or emphasize that anyone who's been to the museum or has any I don't know, some familiarity with Cape Town and District 6 would recognize, unsurprisingly, former residents participate in the world with everyone else, right? So people, so there's sort of a participating in that discourse as well as a differing from it. And what interested me most is where former residents and texts were not repeating the sort of simplified version of what we are to remember. So I think, yeah, regarding the museum and the role of the archive, I think, you know, I don't know how the museum's archive is currently used and has been used. I mean, in my experience, I use the archive, students and researchers use the archive. It is to some extent static, the actual archive of the museum, in the sense that there are sound recordings and photographs and transcripts and books and publications, right? Like it is a holding of material, so it is fixed in that way. Certainly the museum as an institution has occupied all kinds of roles in advocating for the transformation of Cape Town and working with former residents and their descendants. So, you know, the museum as an entity is much more complicated than simply digging deeper, which was the focus of my analysis in the book. Digging Deeper is the permanent exhibit of the District 6 Museum, which opened in 2000 and has remained unchanged for the past 22 years. So I looked at where and how memory was evoked in that exhibit, and what was happening where it wasn't evoked, and what was happening where it was central. And I found that different things were made possible in those sort of like different parts of Digging Deeper. So I can talk in more detail about my analysis of the exhibit if people are interested or familiar with Digging Deeper. I don't know, Noor, did I manage to answer all those questions? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, we have Njogo's question in the chat, and I think that we'll do that one and see where we are for time, but I think that is the last one possibly.
Cool, okay, thank you. Yes, why these two sites? So there is an autobiographical answer, which I alluded to, which is kind of how did this come to be in the first place? Originally, I was really interested in the idea that both Cape Town and the Cape and Dakar, and to a lesser extent, the other 4 communes in Senegal, were working as exemplary exceptions, as kind of exemplary in both senses, as exceptional but representative, particularly in colonial imaginaries. So I was curious about what it could do to bring together this particular kind of South-South and Pan-African comparison, given the sort of complex and odd status of Cape Town and the Cape Colony and the mother city in sort of colonial and apartheid historical discourses here, and sort of the equivalent in Dakar. Dakar was the quote unquote Paris of Africa in the French Empire. So part of the origin of the comparison was that, like, what would happen if I did this kind of comparison that nobody does? I think that one of the things it generates is like I found that collective memory was operating in similar ways surrounding both sites, despite the very big differences between the sites and between these particular pasts. So I think in that sense, it's fruitful, because something like, yes, there's a somewhat shared colonial history, and there is a somewhat shared circumstance of like current neoliberal circumstance that we live in. I think that the workings of the discourses are similar despite the differences, and I think some of the political similarities also come out, partly because the differences are so clear. So when you look at what is similar about them, yeah, that didn't totally make sense. Basically, despite the similarities come out more clearly, in part because the differences are striking. Because that's what I'd like to say.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If anyone has a question, you are more than welcome to voice it now. Okay, while we wait, Cullen, is your book available?
It is available. Those of you who have special connections to the library at WITS might encourage someone to purchase it. It doesn't look, I actually checked in the catalog last week and it didn't appear in the catalog, so perhaps isn't purchased yet. It looks like this. Well, it looks like the slide. Is that clear? This is the physical book. And it is available as an ebook and Kindle. Hard copy is very expensive, but doable for institutions, I think.
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions, but thank you for an amazing presentation, very thought-provoking. Yeah, thank you for making yourself available for our seminar. I think everyone will agree it's really very interesting. Yeah, that's all from our side. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we leave?
No, I think that's it. Thank you all very much. I had a good time and I hope that people, other people did too. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, and that's the end of our seminar. We will be having another one next week, so we'll see you then. Thank you all for joining and your participation. Bye.
Thanks, Cullen. It was great to hear your presentation.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
It was interesting. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, my question, I was interested in the way that you're thinking about the, I'm not a memory person, but like the subaltern way of, that you're talking about people in both contexts are trying to remember or think about the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I think Ali is still there. Ali is our resident memory person. I thought there was something there. And I was just trying to wonder if, I don't know what the different spaces have to do with the way that, I mean, I haven't read your book and I did a quick skim of what you wrote, but I thought there's something really interesting in the way in which, at least that man that you quote in Senegal is thinking about archives.
Yeah, he's great. That was great. Yeah, I think part of what I think I'm doing something to some extent similar to what some of leftist memory scholars do, except I don't think that thing is best done by calling upon memory, right? That's the place where I differ. So that's sort of like, if you're thinking about the date palm iron railings part, here is, right? Here are the ways that people are holding on and retelling and perhaps making a claim on the future through the archival processes. I think that's true and fascinating and evocative. I just don't think that scholars calling that memory is doing anyone any service.
Ali, you're muted.
I'm looking forward also to getting hold of the book. I thought the presentation was quite interesting. I mean, I'm grappling with that issue too, except that I am attempting to use the concept of the everyday in revisiting exhibitions, particularly on forced removals, because the forced removals was in such a massive scale that it is very easy to tell the master narrative of the forced removal and then lose out on the day-to-day, what was the everyday, how did the ordinary people, in inverted commas, respond, but also how do they then tell and retell those stories, and why they are absent, even though we are attempting to redress the problems of exclusion in memorialization in the past. Yeah,
that sounds, I mean, I would love to read. That sounds really interesting. I something I forgot to say, and that maybe is also an answer to your question, Jogu, but like relevant also to what you just said, is that Thiaroye is also a site of forced removal, but nobody calls it that, right? Nobody talks about Dakar as a place of forced removal. There were enormous forced removals, and they're documented. Like historians have written about where the colonial administration put different people. Like they moved villages elsewhere on the peninsula, they moved neighborhoods. So Thiaroye itself experienced, this is the third site that Thiaroye existed on, and it only became a village in the mid-19th century. But that history is not, you know, there's something that I find really intriguing and about how, like what parts of the past people lay claim to and are able to articulate or want to articulate, you know? So I think talking about, like, obviously there are Senegalese historians of the colonial era who have and non-Senegalese scholars who've documented these removals and written about them, but there's not like the way that in South Africa, there's this kind of activist scholar inheritance of like, right? Like not everyone, but a certain kind of historian and scholar knows about forced removal and has a commitment, right? And it's just, yeah. Like if I could do it, if I somehow could do that as a project, like focus on the forced removals of Dakar and call them that, you know, not just say, oh, the village moved. Yes, the village moved. Anyhow. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I felt like in Noor's intervention, there was a little bit of that, like, but the museum is important and doing important work. You need to recognize that. Like, that's kind of what I heard underneath, like the lost part of this question. And I never quite know what to do with that, because my challenge is to a way of thinking about and talking about the past. It's not to the enterprises that have done so in the name of memory. If that makes sense, you know, except I think the pieces of digging deeper that call upon memory in this way and ask us to remember are the weakest and most limited parts. There are other things in that exhibit that are stronger that just aren't doing that, you know? Anyway, I would love to hear more about your work and maybe read something.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll get your email from Njogu, and then I can send you some titles to look at. Yeah.
That would be great. In fact, I can, is that the best way to do it? I could also put it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that then. Thank you, Njogu. I really appreciated your question, and also Sapina, your facilitation.
Oh, okay. I was gonna ask, I hope it was fine, and it didn't. It was like the first one that I've done, so yeah.
It was totally fine. And people, I thought you did, I mean, it all was fine, but also we had a nice group of people that like came forth with questions. So